The morning light over Manoa was slow. Soft mist drifting through the valley, roofs still wet from night rain. From the outside, nothing suggested what waited behind the white door of the Oda house. The curtains were drawn, the car still in the driveway, the street almost silent except for a passing jogger who never looked twice. Inside, the air had already begun to thicken. Still, damp, heavy with something that did not belong to morning. A clock ticked, but no one moved to stop it. Dishes sat untouched on the kitchen counter. A child's shoe lay on its side near the hallway. One lace curled toward the living room. When the officers arrived after the second call, they found the front door locked. Through the window pane, a motionless figure in the hallway. No sound, no response. They entered through the back, and in that quiet house the story began to reveal itself. 5 lives, ended before dawn, in the place they had once called safe. What happened inside that home would become Hawaii's darkest family crime in decades. A case so precise, so silent, that even the neighbors heard nothing but the ordinary sounds of sleep. Yet beneath that calm, a man had decided that the world no longer held room for his mistakes. And when he made that choice, he didn't leave anyone to wake up after him.
The house on East Manoa Road looked ordinary that morning. A 2-story structure, pale beige with a trimmed hedge, the kind of place that disappears into the neighborhood. Mail still sat in the box. A small paper lantern hung from the porch light, swaying faintly with the trade wind. To anyone passing, it was another quiet Sunday. At 8:30 a.m., the first call came in. The dispatcher's log marked it only as disturbance, possible domestic. The voice on the line was female, soft, hesitant. There was noise behind her, a kind of ragged breathing, then static. The number displayed as foreign. When the operator tried to confirm the address, the line cut. 4 minutes later, officers arrived. They parked in front of the house and stood listening. The air smelled faintly of rain and plumeria. No movement behind the curtains. One officer knocked. No answer. A dog barked down the street, then stopped. After 2 more minutes, they left, noting no signs of struggle, no visible injuries, no further sound. The house remained still. Inside, behind the locked door, the scene had already settled. Blood had dried along the hall tiles, thin where it had spread from room to room. The knife lay where it had been dropped near the father's hand. His body positioned halfway down the corridor, one shoulder pressed against the wall as if he had tried to move and stopped mid-motion. In the master bedroom, Naoko lay on her side, face turned toward the window. The curtains were drawn, and morning light traced a narrow line across the floor. Beside her, the phone, the one she had never reached. The children's rooms were smaller, almost identical. Posters on the wall, folded clothes stacked neatly. The youngest, Nana, had been found near her bed. The older 2, Sakurako and Orion, together by the doorway. Their hands showed cuts, shallow but multiple, the marks of resistance. When the second call came at 9:15 a.m., it was from the tenant. Her voice, recorded later in the investigation, stayed calm in tone, but unsteady in rhythm. She said she had heard screaming around 2 a.m., muffled through the walls. At first, she thought it was a movie. Then the sound changed. A crash, something heavy, then silence. She did not open her door. Only at dawn did she notice the dark streak along the floor, slow-moving under the crack. She thought it was water until the smell reached her. When police returned, they met her outside. The front door was still locked. Through the side window, one officer used a flashlight. The beam caught the hallway, the figure lying there, unmoving. They circled to the back, where the sliding door was ajar by an inch. Entry was easy. The silence was immediate, complete. Even the refrigerator hum seemed absent. The first officer stepped in, calling once, his voice low, measured. No response. The air was warm, faintly metallic. He moved down the hallway, shoes pressing into the tacky surface of dried blood. They cleared each room. Living room, empty. Kitchen, utensils undisturbed. A pot still half full of rice on the counter. Bedroom, Naoko, confirmed deceased. Children's rooms, 3 victims, same cause. The last, the father, Paris Oda, pronounced dead on scene from multiple stab wounds. The final one, self-inflicted to the chest. It took only 20 minutes to map the entire sequence. The wounds were consistent. A kitchen knife from the set on the counter. The lack of forced entry confirmed it was internal. The house showed no sign of struggle beyond the rooms where the family had tried to move. One overturned chair, one cracked phone screen, one trail leading back to the hallway where it ended. By 10 a.m., the block was sealed. Neighbors gathered outside, quiet, holding their phones. Some whispered names. Others said they had seen the family just the day before, shopping, unloading groceries, the father watering the plants. Nothing seemed wrong. The medical examiner arrived at 10:45. Photographs were taken, every angle, every room. The clock in the kitchen showed 2:19 a.m., frozen when power was briefly cut. That, investigators believed, was the last blow was struck. Outside, rain began again, light, almost mist. The scent of wet soil mixed with something sharper. Officers moved slowly, preserving what little pattern remained. A child's notebook lay open on the dining table, a drawing of a sun with 5 smiling figures beneath it. Someone had written a word above it in pencil, Ohana. The tenant sat on the curb, wrapped in a blanket, her hands trembling around a paper cup. When questioned, she said she had never really spoken to them beyond greetings. They were quiet, polite, private. She did not know what the father did for work. She did not know why he had seemed distracted lately. She did not know what had changed in that house. But something had. In the week before the murders, Paris had stopped answering calls from relatives. He had told his wife he was trying to fix something big. She thought he meant work. In reality, he had received notice from the IRS. Unpaid taxes, years overdue. The debt was larger than he had admitted. He had told a cousin, in a message later recovered, that he was done running and that no one will understand what I must do. By the time police found that message, everything was already finished. The coroner's report noted a pattern of controlled violence, deliberate, targeted, and final. Each family member had been attacked in close succession, beginning with the mother. The scene suggested no hesitation. After the final act, Paris had walked to the hallway, leaned against the wall, and pressed the blade inward. The wound was deep, the angle precise, the kind that does not invite rescue. When investigators left that day, the house was sealed with yellow tape. The wind kept brushing it, making a faint flapping sound against the railing. Across the street, someone had placed small flowers near the mailbox. They were already beginning to wilt. By evening, the news broke. 5 dead in Manoa. No witnesses, no survival. Just a single story, closed before daylight. The neighborhood would not forget the silence that followed. Even months later, residents said they could still hear the echo of that morning. Not the screams, but the absence of them. And in that quiet absence, the story of the Oda family began to turn from tragedy into something colder. An investigation into how a life built on ordinary routines could conceal the moment it was about to end. The investigation began before noon. Detectives from the Honolulu Police Department's Homicide Division arrived with quiet precision, their steps echoing faintly through the narrow halls of the Oda home. Outside, the humidity clung to everything: shirts, notebooks, lenses. Reporters had gathered near the curb, their cameras trained on the yellow tape fluttering in the light wind. Inside, the air barely moved. Evidence technicians worked silently, taking photographs, marking numbered cards along the hallway. Each small item, the knife, the phone, the wallet, was logged and sealed. A thin smell of bleach still hung in the kitchen, as if someone had tried to clean before stopping midway. Detective Lau, lead on the case, noted how little chaos there was. The violence was controlled. The angles of the wounds, the proximity of each victim, they suggested intent, not impulse. The first blow had come in the master bedroom. From there, a slow progression outward. Each room told a fragment of the same story, written in silence and precision. By early afternoon, the team traced the timeline backward. The first 911 call at 8:30 a.m., cut before address confirmation. The second at 9:15 a.m., the tenant's voice, trembling but coherent. Estimated time of death, between 1:45 and 2:30 a.m. Phone records showed Paris had made no outgoing calls after midnight. One unsent text sat open on his phone. "I'm sorry, I can't fix this anymore." The message was addressed to his wife, though her phone had been found beside her on the bed, shattered. The detectives moved methodically through financial records. Bank statements revealed overdrafts stretching back months. The family's last mortgage payment was 6 weeks overdue. His small IT business had folded quietly in late 2023. Paris had told friends he was consulting, but the account deposits had stopped. There was another thread: tax documents, unopened envelopes stacked in the study, letters from the Internal Revenue Service, all marked final notice. The most recent, dated February 24th, warned of pending legal action. The handwriting on one envelope's corner caught attention. Naucos, in pen, the single word, talk. Neighbors interviewed later described the Odas as private but kind. The children walked to school together, their mother often waiting by the gate. The father, they said, was polite but withdrawn, seen watering plants or leaving early in his car. No loud arguments, no visible tension. The kind of family that kept to itself, whose tragedies would never seem possible until they happened. At the station, Detective Lau read through the transcript of the tenant's statement again. The small details stood out: the time she heard the thud, the sound like a heavy drawer closing, the dripping under the door. She had smelled cleaning liquid, she said, like when someone mops too much. That was hours before dawn. The crime scene team confirmed what she could not see. After the killings, Paris had attempted to wipe certain surfaces: the counters, the knife handle, the floor leading to the back door. Not out of concealment, perhaps, but as ritual. The forensic report suggested deliberate movements, a man buying time without reason. By the third day, the psychological profile began to take shape. Male, mid-40s, no criminal record, no history of domestic violence. High-functioning, socially isolated, financially collapsing. Statements from relatives revealed he had confessed fear of prison for tax evasion. 2 months before the murders, he told his brother-in-law he would take everyone with him if it came to that. The words, dismissed at the time, became haunting in hindsight. Investigators recovered a note from his desk drawer, half-written and unsigned. The handwriting matched his. "They say debt can be repaid, but not this kind. I made sure they won't have to know what comes next. Forgive me for not finding another way." There were no traces of alcohol or drugs in his system. Toxicology confirmed sobriety. The act was lucid. The coroner's testimony later described the sequence as systematic, premeditated, emotionally detached. No evidence of rage, only precision. Each wound placed where it would end resistance quickly. The children's defensive injuries were shallow, suggesting confusion rather than struggle. By the end of that week, the case was formally ruled a murder-suicide. No further suspects. Still, something in the file resisted finality. Why the first 911 call at 8:30 a.m.? Who made it? The number traced to a foreign SIM card, later identified as belonging to a visiting relative from Japan who had stayed briefly months earlier. But the line was active again that morning, calling from the same neighborhood cell tower. Investigators theorized that Naoko, during the argument hours before the killings, might have borrowed the phone. Perhaps she tried to reach help quietly. The call dropped. The phone was never found. Only its signal, logged once, fading at 8:31 a.m., long after her death. In interviews, the responding officers from that first visit recounted the uneasy silence of that morning. One officer said he felt something off, but saw no cause to force entry. Department policy required visual confirmation of distress, and none was present. That detail would later ignite debate, whether earlier intervention might have changed the outcome. But in the chain of events, the gap between the screams and discovery was 7 hours. 7 hours where the house sat locked, the air cooling, the clock ticking in the kitchen. The following week, reporters gathered outside the station, asking about motive. Financial pressure, the spokesperson said. But Lau knew the truth ran quieter than that. Financial collapse explains debt. It does not explain extinction. He reviewed the last message Paris sent to his wife weeks earlier. "We need a plan. No one will take care of them like we do." There was no response in the thread. In the drawer near the note, police found a family photograph, 5 faces smiling under sunlight, taken years before. The picture frame's glass was cracked, not shattered. That small imperfection, Lau wrote in his notes, looked deliberate. He spent days reconstructing the final hours. Dinner at 8 p.m., lights out at 10, an argument between midnight and 1. The pattern of blood, the direction of movement, the final act near the hall, each step of a man following an inner map. When he stood again inside the house, now empty of bodies but full of echoes, Lau noted how quiet it felt. The fan blades turned slowly, dust settling on the floor markers that had been removed. Outside, children walked home from school, their laughter distant. He closed his notebook. The case, by procedure, was done. But the silence inside that house felt unfinished, like a sentence missing its last word. That night, Lau sat in his car outside the property. Rain returned, thin and steady. Through the fogged windshield, he could see the lantern still hanging on the porch. Someone had relit it after the cleanup. It glowed faintly in the wind, swinging. He wrote one final line in his report. The scene holds, even when the people do not. And with that, the Manoa murders joined the long archive of crimes that end without explanation, where logic stops at the threshold of the human mind. In the weeks that followed, the investigation shifted from evidence to motive. There were no mysteries left about what had happened. The question that lingered, quiet, persistent, was why. Detective Lau returned to the Oda home one last time before it was cleared for release. The walls were bare now, the carpets stripped, the scent of cleaning chemicals sharp but hollow. Light came through the open blinds for the first time in months. Dust hung in it like fine ash. He stood in the middle of the living room, where a photograph had once been mounted, a family portrait taken near Waikiki Beach. The marks on the wall, where the frame had hung, were still visible, faint rectangles of cleaner paint. It was here, he thought, that the first fracture began, long before the crime, not in anger, but in quiet erosion. Relatives described Paris as meticulous. He planned every purchase, wrote budgets by hand, logged receipts in notebooks. His colleagues called him private, precise, polite. He had built a world where order gave him peace. When that order began to fail, first in business, then in debt, he responded not with desperation, but with silence. Emails recovered from his laptop painted the slow decline. Polite inquiries to clients unanswered, tax notices unopened, then drafts of apology messages that were never sent. One document, titled simply Contingency, contained a list written like an itinerary: close accounts, pay insurance, prepare, together. There was no step 5. Psychologists reviewing the case later described it as a narcissistic collapse, a phenomenon where self-image and moral reasoning dissolve at the same pace. But Lau saw something colder, not ego, not panic, just a man rearranging the end of his life as if it were another task to complete. In one entry from February, Paris wrote, "They'd trust me. I can't let them suffer through what's coming. It will be peaceful, quick. I'll make sure they don't feel anything." The handwriting was steady, not the script of a frantic man, but of someone resolved. The human mind does not easily accommodate the thought of killing those it loves. To do so requires a distortion, an internal logic that replaces empathy with certainty. Paris had convinced himself that the world beyond his control would destroy his family worse than he could. Poverty, shame, exposure. He imagined he was protecting them from the humiliation of his failure. It wasn't rage that drove him. It was ownership. The same control that once organized his household now directed its destruction. When Naoko learned of the unpaid taxes, she begged him to seek help. Her messages to her sister showed concern, not fear. She wrote, "He's quiet. I think he's embarrassed." 2 weeks later, she wrote again, "He's stopped sleeping, keeps checking the locks." It was the last message she sent. The night before the murders, he searched online for Family Murder Cases Japan, then Painless Death. In his browsing history, the pages showed him what he wanted to see, stories where others had done the same, where despair masqueraded as mercy. At 1:45 a.m., neighbors' security cameras caught faint movement near the Oda porch light. The motion sensor blinked once, then again. It was Paris stepping out to the yard, looking at the street, perhaps checking if anyone was awake, perhaps saying goodbye. Inside, his family was asleep. In the span of 45 minutes, he carried out what he later described in the unfinished note as the plan. The order matched the hierarchy of protection he had always enforced. First Naoko, then the eldest, then the youngest. Each act followed a terrible logic, each decision made to preserve what he called unity. When it was done, he sat on the hallway floor, where he had once watched his children play with building blocks. He rested for several minutes. Then he pressed the blade to his chest. The forensics timeline confirmed this sequence. No hesitation cuts, no panic. A single decisive wound. The following morning, as investigators pieced together the scene, Lau began noticing smaller details others had overlooked. On the refrigerator door, under the magnets, a calendar page was marked in red ink. March 10, reset. On the bedside table, a single photograph of Naoko, smiling, her face half-shadowed by sunlight. And on the desk, a note written not by him, but by his daughter Sakurako. "Dad, please don't be sad. We can help." The paper had been folded once, never delivered. The psychologists later debated what drove him to cross that invisible line between despair and destruction. Some said it was cultural pressure, the inherited shame of failure. Others pointed to untreated depression, the slow collapse of a man who could not ask for help. But to Lau, it was simpler. Paris had lost the mirror of reality. When shame becomes larger than life, it can devour life itself. He reread the text he had written weeks earlier to his wife. Quote, "No one will take better care of them than me." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise warped by delusion, a declaration that blurred protection with possession. In that realization, Lau felt the weight of quiet horror that no evidence could record. The logic of a man who loved his family so completely he could not imagine a world where they existed without him. When the psychological report arrived, it confirmed what the silence had already said. Paris's mind had folded inward. No drugs, no psychosis, just an idea taken too far. They called it a closed-circuit tragedy, a perfect loop of fear, control, and misguided devotion, ending exactly where it began. By April, the Oda house was sold to a private buyer. The lantern was gone, the windows were replaced, new paint covered the marks on the wall. Yet every officer who had entered that morning said they could still recall the temperature of the air, the stillness that felt aware. In a quiet neighborhood like Manoa, life moved on, but the silence remained. The local paper published a small follow-up months later. Quote, "Community mourns family lost to financial desperation." It was an easy phrase for something far more complex. Despair is simple. The mind that justifies it is not. The Oda murders faded from the headlines, archived among countless other domestic tragedies. But for those who entered that house, the case stayed, unresolved not in fact, but in meaning. There was no insanity here, no external evil, just a man who mistook destruction for care. And somewhere between those two illusions lies the quiet terror of what human certainty can become when no one else is left to challenge it. The house stood empty for weeks. A single light remained on in the hallway, left by the investigation team. Neighbors said it glowed all night, casting a dull yellow square across the hedge. Then one morning, it went dark, power finally disconnected. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before. By April, the Oda home was a property listing. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, charming Manoa view, no mention of what had happened inside. The price had dropped twice by summer. Agent spoke softly when showing it, avoiding questions about history. Yet even after cleaning, repainting, replacing floors, something in the air refused to clear. For the detectives, the paperwork closed easily, but some cases don't end with signatures. They stay in the pauses between sentences, in the faint memories of soundless rooms. Detective Lau still drove by the street sometimes, not for duty, but out of habit. He said it reminded him that evil wasn't always loud, and that sometimes the cruelest acts are done with calm precision. He'd sit in his car, window down, listening. The sound of the wind through palm leaves, the steady hum of traffic beyond the valley. Life continuing, unaware. At headquarters, the file was archived under familicide, resolved. Yet among officers, it had another name, the house that waited. There had been no sign of struggle outside, no scream that reached a neighbor. The crime was contained, like a secret folded perfectly within itself. Every fact fit together neatly, yet none of it explained the stillness that lingered in the photographs. During the months that followed, the surviving relatives arrived quietly from Japan. They attended the memorial service in Honolulu, where 5 framed portraits stood in a line. The mother, Naoko, in a summer dress. The children smiling, their ages marked beneath each name. And Paris, his frame smaller, the photo cropped tight. No one spoke his name during the ceremony. Only prayers, delivered in low voices, rising faintly against the sound of rain. Afterward, the family returned home with what was left: the ashes, the paperwork, and questions that had no answers. They said little to reporters. The words financial hardship appeared again and again, but it felt too narrow, too clinical, to contain what had happened. A neighbor later told a local station that she still saw the children's drawings in her mind. She said, "They were always laughing. I keep thinking maybe they were still dreaming when it happened." Months later, Lau visited the evidence archive for one last look. Inside a plastic sleeve, the items were labeled and sealed. The kitchen knife, the cracked phone, the wallet folded open to an ID card. Beneath them, a single page, the note that ended with, "Forgive me." He studied the handwriting again. The pen pressure light at the start, heavier at the end. The ink bled slightly where the point had paused, not from hesitation, but exhaustion. When he placed it back, he realized that every line in the report, every photograph, every timestamp had created a mirror, not of the killer, but of something more ordinary. The slow corrosion of certainty, the quiet surrender of someone who once believed control could protect him from everything. There are cases where evil feels foreign, an intrusion from outside the human frame. This was not one of them. It was built from the same instincts that shape care, duty, and love, turned inward until they strangled themselves. The mind that seeks to preserve can also destroy. And in that fragile symmetry lies the reason these stories haunt so deeply, because they are not alien, only distorted. By late summer, new occupants had moved into the house. The lantern on the porch was gone, replaced by a wind chime. On certain mornings, it could be heard faintly from the street, a soft metallic song that rose with the valley wind. People passing by no longer stopped. The police tape had long been removed, the reporters gone, the story fading from news feeds. Yet the silence inside that house remained part of the city's quiet memory, another address people forgot how to mention. For Lau, it ended one evening months later, when he closed his notebook and left the station after his shift. He wrote no final report, no reflection, only a short line at the bottom of the case log. Nothing left to find. He meant it as conclusion, but as he drove home he knew it wasn't entirely true, because every case like this leaves a residue, not in evidence, but in the mind that tries to understand it. The residue of a question without a clean answer. How does love become this quiet? How does a man convince himself that mercy and destruction are the same act? There was no moment when Paris Oda lost his sanity. There was only a slow fading of light, of perspective, until everything outside himself disappeared. That, Lau thought, was the real crime, not what he did, but how ordinary the reasoning sounded before it turned fatal. The Oda murders would be remembered as Hawaii's deadliest family killing in decades. But beyond the headlines and reports, it became something else, a study in the thinness of stability, the fragility of what people call normal. Every morning, across quiet neighborhoods, lights turn on, coffee brews, doors lock, alarms set. Routine, order, safety. Illusions that hold only until they don't. And when they break, the silence that follows sounds exactly like this one did. Steady, unbroken, final. The house on East Manoa Road stands still tonight. Different owners, different laughter. But the air, if you listen long enough, still carries the faintest trace of that morning's quiet, a stillness that remembers, even if no one else does.